satellite imagery from March 2nd, 2026 has just confirmed it. A $300 million US THAAD radar in Jordan, the critical eye of a missile defense system, is now a blackened crater of twisted metal. But that is not the real story. In just 5 days, Iran accomplished what no power has managed to do to America in modern history. Not Russia, not China, not the Soviet Union at the height of its power. They destroyed half of America's entire missile defense network in the Middle East. This isn't a simple military failure. It is a terrifying industrial one. And to understand how this was not just possible, but mathematically inevitable, we have to look to a concept from a world far from the battlefield, best summarized by Elon Musk. Welcome to production hell. That hell doesn't begin in a factory. It begins on the battlefield with a calculator. To understand the collapse of America's defensive shield, you must first understand the simple, brutal math that Iran's military planners built their entire strategy around. Their objective was never to outfight America. It was to bankrupt its defenses. The trigger was a meticulously planned saturation attack. Over 500 low-cost ballistic missiles and swarms of cheap drones were launched across the region. The sole purpose was not to achieve kinetic kills, but to force the US defense systems to fire, to empty the silos. This is where the math becomes disastrous. Iran's arsenal featured swarms of Shahed drones costing between $20,000 and $50,000 apiece. To counter these, the US was forced to launch its premier interceptors, the PAC-3 Patriots, which cost $3 to $4 million each. Often standard doctrine requires firing 2 interceptors per target to ensure a kill. Think about that exchange. You are using an asset that costs at minimum 150 times more than the target it's destroying. You are trading a supercar for a bicycle over and over again. The consequence of this exchange was mathematically predictable and swift. In just the first 5 days, the United States expended over 800 of these Patriot interceptors. The total cost was approximately $2.4 billion. Let that number settle. That is more interceptors, more ordnance than were used across nearly 3 years of the entire war in Ukraine. And in the process, Iran successfully degraded or destroyed half of the deployed Patriot systems themselves. Another $7 to $8 billion in strategic hardware gone. But the financial loss, as staggering as it is, isn't the real story. The real story is what you cannot replace. America's peacetime production rate is about 2 THAAD interceptors per week. In the first week of this conflict, Iran launched 500 ballistic missiles. The math produces only one outcome. This isn't a battle of skill anymore, it's a battle of inventory, and it raises a terrifying question that no one at the Pentagon can answer. How do you win a war of attrition when your factory can't even keep up with the first day of losses? With stockpiles vaporizing, the order from the White House was absolute: surge production. Immediately, the demand sent to the heart of the American military-industrial complex was precise: increase the annual production of THAAD interceptors from 96 to 400. It was a desperate, logical demand. And the response was the moment the tactical problem became a strategic nightmare. Picture the scene. The secure video conference. The faces of generals and cabinet secretaries in the situation room waiting for a plan, for a number they could work with. And then the answer comes from the contractors. A full ramp-up to meet that wartime demand would take 7 years. However, 7 years. Let that number settle. In that room, the silence wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of a paradigm shattering, the disbelief on the faces of men who command carrier groups, turning to a dawning quiet horror. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a highball offer to be haggled down. It was a statement of industrial physics. The deep, catastrophic truth of America's military might was laid bare. For decades, the industrial base had been optimized for peace. It was designed for slow, methodical, high-profit production runs. The specialized supply chains for things like rocket motors, the trained workforce, the specific tooling required for a surge, they simply did not exist. In fact, we know this isn't a hypothetical. Lockheed Martin's own projections to triple PAC-3 capacity, a less complex system, confirmed a 7-year timeline. The dependency on foreign imports for key minerals like chromium and cobalt created bottlenecks that no amount of political will could fix overnight. This is the checkmate move in the industrial war. The final invoice from the asymmetric depletion math had finally arrived at the factory floor, and it produced the central, inescapable paradox that sealed the outcome. You cannot fight a 7-month war with a 7-year replacement timeline. The war was already lost, not on the battlefield, but in the spreadsheets and manufacturing plants thousands of miles away. This 7-year industrial lag is a reality check for the military. But it makes you wonder, what other critical systems in our economy are running on similar, dangerously fragile, peacetime assumptions? Share your thoughts below. With the industrial solution off the table, the timeline unbreakable, the leadership was cornered. The math produced only one outcome, and it was defeat. So what happens when brute force fails and manufacturing cannot answer the call? What is the final desperate move a superpower makes to avoid admitting the game is already over? The final desperate move a superpower makes is the one it understands best. A decapitation strike. The logic, from Washington's perspective, was brutally simple. Assassinate Iran's supreme military coordinator, shatter the command and control network, and let the entire war effort collapse into chaos. The strike was executed with precision. The target was eliminated. And the result was a catastrophic success for Iran. Because the command structure did not shatter, it did not create a power vacuum. Instead, the strike triggered a continuity of government plan that had been quietly in place for 2 decades. This wasn't an improvisation. It was doctrine. The IRGC's entire strategy was built on what they called a Mosaic Defense. The moment the head of the snake was removed, the central nervous system instantly dissolved and reformed into 31 autonomous provincial commands. Think about what that means. You no longer have one enemy. You have 31, each with a pre-designated commander, with successors identified 3 ranks deep, and each with pre-authorized retaliatory targets and standing orders to attack. There was no one left to call them off. In the hours that followed, the phone lines from Beijing, Moscow, and Brussels went dead. Mediators were trying to find an authority to appeal to for a ceasefire, but there was no one to answer the call. The horror began to settle in Washington. They had tried to create a power vacuum, but instead, they had created 31 autonomous command structures. They had not weakened the enemy. They had made the conflict permanent. In a single act, America had personally destroyed the only diplomatic off-ramp that ever existed. But this spiral of escalation, this perfectly executed trap unfolding in the Middle East, it was not happening in a vacuum. Thousands of miles away, another player, one who had remained silent on the sidelines, was watching the board. This chaos was not just chaos, it was a signal, and they were about to make their move. The chaos in the Middle East was not a self-contained fire. It was a shockwave, and its primary target was the global energy market. The signal of American strategic distraction and escalating violence sent oil prices into a spiral. But this chaos wasn't just a problem. For one observer, it was a golden opportunity. The player watching from thousands of miles away was in Moscow. From the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin saw the board with perfect clarity. He watched as leaders in Berlin and Brussels stared at their terminal screens, the green numbers of gas futures turning blood red. He saw their panic over oil supplies from the Gulf, and he chose that exact moment to make his move. On March 4th, 2026, speaking on Russian state television, Putin delivered a calm, chilling threat. He stated, "Perhaps it would be more profitable for us to stop supplying the European market right now." This was not a bluff. It was a proven geopolitical weapon, taken directly from a playbook he had run just a few years earlier. Let's be clear, in 2022, in response to European support for Ukraine, Russia cut its piped gas deliveries by half, a reduction of 83 billion cubic meters. This action alone quadrupled energy prices and pushed European industry to the breaking point. The threat in 2026 was credible because it was a documented capability. The first domino had now tipped the next. Iran's attrition war handed Moscow the perfect leverage at almost no cost. Europe was now facing a dual energy shock, a crisis of oil from the south, and now the explicit threat of a gas crisis from the east. It was a strategic checkmate, turning Europe's energy dependency into a tool to force concessions on Ukraine. But these grand geopolitical chess moves are not just for heads of state. This global realignment has a price tag, and that bill is about to be sent directly to the public, impacting the inflation you feel and the value of the assets you hold. All this chaos, all this strategy, it's about to hit your wallet. And in the moments to come, we will calculate the precise cost. Let's begin that calculation. This global chessboard has a direct, tangible impact on your portfolio. The strategic depletion of military hardware translates directly into severe energy price tail risks. The causal chain is direct. First, consider the asymmetric math now applied to the global economy. In the Red Sea, a proxy fires a $20,000 drone. To counter it, the US Navy is forced to fire a $2 million interceptor. This exchange ratio is unsustainable. As a real-world precedent, a single US carrier strike group, the Eisenhower, recently fired 155 multi-million-dollar Standard missiles in one deployment. The entire procurement budget for the next fiscal year is for only about 125 of those missiles. The industrial base cannot keep pace. This creates the second link in the chain, a multi-year vulnerability window. With each interceptor taking over 2 years to produce, the 7-year industrial lag we identified earlier means the US military simply lacks the capacity to guarantee the security of global energy shipping lanes against this low-cost harassment. When trade routes are at risk, the market reacts instantly. This brings us to the final, personal cost. We've already seen oil prices surge from a baseline of $95 to $150 a barrel, with credible Wall Street analyses projecting a potential spike to $200. This is not a temporary shock. It is a persistent, structural inflationary pressure fueled by unchecked volatility. Insurance rates for oil tankers triple. The price you pay at the pump rises. And that inflationary heat systematically erodes the real returns of your portfolio, outpacing the conventional hedges you rely on. That is the blowback. This math produces only one outcome. When the industrial base cannot resupply the military and the economy cannot withstand the inflationary blowback from trying what is the only strategic option left on the table. The only strategic option left on the table was to acknowledge the math. The final invoice for the depletion campaign had arrived, and the price was withdrawal. Inside the White House, the debate was over before it began. It was no longer a question of strategy, but of arithmetic. Imagine the president, late at night, not wrestling with conscience, but staring at 3 charts projected onto the wall. The first showed a steep red line, the interceptor inventory plunging towards zero. The second, a violent green spike, the price of oil going vertical. And the third, a collapsing blue line, his political approval rating. The numbers made the decision for him. Domestically, the political ground had completely vanished. Polling showed that an unprecedented 90% of the American population now opposed the war. Think about that. A complete inversion from the 93% who supported intervention after 9/11. The reality was simple. The military assets were gone, with a 7-year industrial lag before they could be replaced. The economy was buckling under the inflationary blowback. And politically, continuing the war was electoral suicide. The discussions shifted. It wasn't about how to achieve victory, but how to brand the defeat. Terms were workshopped to save face. Strategic pause, mission realignment, anything to avoid the word retreat. But it was inevitable. The withdrawal was set in motion. But as the plans were being drawn, a final chilling footnote emerged from the intelligence briefings, a detail that reframed the entire conflict. The drones, the missiles, the entire arsenal that had brought a superpower to its knees was Iran's old inventory, the weapons they were willing to lose. In the final analysis, this was more than a military defeat. It was a collision with reality, a failure born from strategic hubris and a willful ignorance of the brutal physics of industrial warfare. The ultimate lesson is a simple one, and it is unforgiving. A superpower's true strength is not found in its most sophisticated, most expensive weapons. It is found in its ability to produce and sustain them under the relentless, grinding pressure of attrition. A test this system failed. But the most chilling part of this entire story is what didn't happen. Iran achieved this victory using its expendable arsenal. The weapons it was willing to lose, its most advanced, most precise and most powerful missiles, the ones it carefully preserved throughout the entire conflict, were never even launched. They remain in their launch systems today. Somewhere in the cold silence of a reinforced bunker, you can almost hear the faint hum of active electronics, fully fueled, fully targeted, waiting. History doesn't grade leaders on their intentions, it grades them on results. And the final verdict on this strategic reality may be yet to come. If this analysis provides a framework to see the world differently, to understand the deeper currents of risk and power, then subscribe. This channel is for those who seek the verdict of reality, not just the noise of the news.